I never thought my own flesh and blood would be the one to break my heart. Not David. Not my boy who I raised alone after George passed. The child I sacrificed everything for. But here I am, sitting in this sterile room at Sunset Grove Senior, living, staring at the single suitcase that now contains my entire life. The smell of antiseptic burns my nostrils as I run my fingers over the small bruise on my arm. The seemingly innocent injury that became their perfect excuse. "It's just temporary, Mom," David had said, his wife Claire nodding beside him with that practiced smile of hers. "Just until we can make your apartment safer." I should have seen through their lies, but maybe I chose not to. Maybe I wanted to. Believe that my son still had my best interests at heart. The truth revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in dark water. First, it was the sale of my furniture, done without my knowledge or consent. Then my clothes disappeared, donated to charity without anyone asking me. My small but cherished apartment, the one I'd worked so hard to buy in Charleston after selling our family home to fund David's law school dreams, was rented out to strangers. But the final blow came through the innocent words of my grandson, Ethan. "Grandma's going to live here forever now," he'd announced during one of their increasingly rare visits, his child's honesty cutting through the web of adult deceptions. I remember how David's face had tightened, how Claire had quickly changed the subject, but the truth was already out. This wasn't temporary. This was exile. I sit here now, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the institutional, green carpet. The walls are decorated with generic watercolor prints that someone thought would make this place feel more like home. They don't. Nothing here feels like home. The corridors echo with shuffling footsteps and muted television sounds, punctuated by the occasional call button's harsh buzz. 40 years of teaching at Charleston Public School, working double shifts, selling my mother's jewelry piece by piece to ensure David could have everything he needed. All of it reduced to this. A small room with a single bed, a plastic-covered armchair, and a window overlooking a manicured but soulless garden. My son, now a prominent lawyer in New York, has declared me legally incompetent with the help of some doctor friend of his. Every cent I own, every decision I might make, now requires his approval. The arthritis in my hands isn't nearly as painful as this betrayal. I'm 76, not dead. I'm not senile, though they'd like to believe I am. I taught literature to generations of students, helped countless young minds find their way. And now I'm treated like a child who can't decide when to eat or what to wear. But there's something they don't know, something I've kept close to my heart for 15 years, like a hidden flame that refuses to die. As I watch the sun set over the carefully trimmed hedges of Sunset Grove, I allow myself a small smile. They think they've written the end of my story, but they have no idea that this is just the beginning. Sometimes the most powerful moves are made in absolute silence, and I've always been good at playing the long game, after all. I didn't raise a successful lawyer without learning a thing or two about strategy myself. The morning George died, I remember thinking the world should have stopped turning. He was only 42, and David was just 8 years old. One moment we were a complete family, having breakfast in our Charleston home, and the next, a heart attack, had torn our world apart. But the world didn't stop. It never does. The bills kept coming. David kept growing. And I had to figure out how to be both mother and father to a boy who'd just lost his hero. I still remember the weight of my wedding ring as I placed it in the velvet box along with my mother's pearls, and the gold bracelet George had given me on our 10th anniversary. The jewelry store owner's eyes were kind as he counted out the cash. He offered more than they were worth, perhaps seeing the desperation in my eyes. That money paid for David's braces and his first laptop for school. Teaching at Charleston Public School didn't pay much, but it was steady work. During the day, I taught literature to teenagers who mostly dreamed of being anywhere else. At night, I graded papers and took on evening classes for adult education. Sometimes I'd catch David watching me from the doorway of our small dining room as I worked late into the night, his young face serious and thoughtful. "Go to bed, sweetheart," I'd say. But he'd just shake his head and bring me another cup of coffee. There were suitors, of course. Tom Henderson, the chemistry teacher, asked me out countless times. Marcus Williams, a widowed banker whose daughter was in my class, took me to dinner once. But dating meant time away from David, money spent on babysitters, emotional energy I couldn't spare. Besides, no one could replace George, and I wasn't looking to try. Instead, I poured everything into David. Every parent-teacher conference, every baseball game, every science fair. I was there. When he showed an interest in debate club, I stayed up late helping him practice his arguments. When he struggled with calculus, I hired the best tutor I could afford, eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch to save money. The proudest day of my life was when David got accepted to law school in New York. I remember standing in our living room, holding that acceptance letter, my hands shaking. He was beaming, talking about Manhattan and corporate law and all his dreams. I didn't tell him then about the meeting I'd had with our realtor earlier that day. Our house, the one where George and I had started our family, where David had taken his first steps. It would fetch a good price in the market, enough to cover most of his tuition. "Mom, you can't sell the house," David protested when I finally told him. But I could see the hope in his eyes, the way they kept drifting back to that acceptance letter. "It's just a house," I said, though my heart ached at the thought of leaving. "Your future is more important." The day we packed up, I found David's old height marks on the kitchen doorframe. Each little pencil line told a story. The growth spurt after his father died, the summer he shot up 5 inches, the last mark made just before his high school graduation. I ran my fingers over them one last time before the movers painted over them. We got a good price for the house, just as the realtor promised. I moved into a small apartment, and David went to New York. The phone calls came daily at first. He'd tell me about his classes, his new friends, the excitement of the city. I'd listen, picturing him in his new life, trying to ignore the emptiness of my downsized space. Those first few years he'd come home for every holiday. We'd cook George's recipes together, and he'd tell me about his internships at prestigious firms. When he met Claire during his final year, I was happy for him. She was beautiful, ambitious, from a good family. If I noticed how she subtly corrected his table manners or made comments about his humble beginnings, I kept it to myself. After all, mothers don't always have to like their children's choices. We just have to support them. Looking back now, I wonder if I loved him too much, sacrificed too deeply. They say you can't spoil a child with love, but maybe you can blind them with it. Maybe in trying to give him everything, I somehow taught him that everything could be taken. They say change happens gradually, then all at once, like water wearing away at stone, drop by drop, until suddenly the whole cliff face crumbles. That's how I lost my son. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 tiny cuts I barely felt until the bleeding wouldn't stop. It started after Ethan was born. I'd flown to New York, eager to help with my new grandson. Claire's mother was already installed in their guest room, so they put me up in a hotel nearby. "It's more comfortable for everyone this way," Claire had explained with that brittle smile of hers. I spent my days watching her mother monopolize the baby, while I sat on their expensive couch, feeling like an intruder in my son's life. The Daily phone calls had already dwindled to weekly ones by then. David was always in a meeting or about to head into court. When we did talk, it was surface-level conversation. The weather, Ethan's latest milestone, his recent victory in some corporate case. Gone were the long discussions about books, politics, life, the kind we used to have when he was growing up. Sometimes I'd mention a student who reminded me of him, and he'd change the subject so quickly it felt like a door slamming in my face. Then came the holidays. First Thanksgiving. "We're spending it with Claire's family in Connecticut this year, Mom. Their tradition, you understand." Then Christmas. "We're taking Ethan to Aspen for his first ski trip." Even my birthday. "Sorry, Mom, but I've got this huge merger case." I watched through Facebook as my grandson grew. Claire posted professional photos of their perfect family, matching outfits at the Hamptons, birthday parties that looked like movie sets, vacations in places I couldn't pronounce. Sometimes I'd comment, just to remind them I was still here. Claire would respond with a polite, "Thanks, Margaret," as if I were some distant acquaintance rather than her son's mother. The arthritis started creeping in around then. Nothing serious. My hands would ache after grading papers. My knees would protest on rainy days. But I kept teaching, kept living independently in my small apartment. I had my routines. Morning coffee at the local diner where they knew my order by heart, afternoon walks in Hampton Park, evening phone calls to old colleagues who'd become friends. But David and Claire saw weakness where there was only age. Every minor ailment became ammunition in their arsenal of concern. "Mom, are you sure you should still be living alone?" "Margaret, have you considered assisted living?" "There are some lovely places." Each suggestion came wrapped in worry, tied with ribbons of love. But underneath was something harder, colder. The fall in my kitchen wasn't serious. I was reaching for a mixing bowl on the top shelf, lost my balance, and caught myself on the counter. Yes, my arm bruised. At my age, bruising is as natural as breathing. But when I mentioned it casually, during one of our rare phone calls, something in David's voice changed. He and Claire flew down the next weekend, armed with brochures for Sunset Grove Senior Living. "It's one of the best facilities in the state," Claire said, flipping through glossy pages, showing smiling seniors playing bingo and painting watercolors. "And it's so close to your apartment." "The doctors there are top-notch," David added, not meeting my eyes. "They'll take care of everything." I should have seen it then. The way they exchanged glances, how they'd clearly rehearsed this conversation. But I was so grateful for their sudden attention, so touched by what I thought was genuine concern, that I missed the steel trap closing around me. "Just for a few weeks," they promised, "while we renovate your apartment to make it safer." I packed a single suitcase thinking I'd be back home soon. David helped me fold my clothes, and for a moment it felt like old times. My son taking care of me the way I'd always taken care of him. If I'd known it was the last time I'd see my apartment as my home, I might have lingered longer. Might have memorized every crack in the ceiling, every worn spot on the carpet. But that's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets and drums. It comes softly, wearing the mask of love, speaking the language of care. And by the time you recognize it for what it is, you're already caught in its web. The truth found me on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after I'd moved into Sunset Grove. I was sitting in the common room, pretending to read a magazine, while actually watching Mrs. Henderson argue with her daughter about her medication, when the mail cart rolled by. Among the usual pamphlets and promotional materials was a thin envelope from my bank. The statement inside made my hands shake. Multiple withdrawals from my accounts, property management fees for my apartment, a furniture consignment receipt. They hadn't just moved me. They'd liquidated my life. I remember walking back to my room in a daze, each step echoing against the polished floors. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the fluorescent lights harsh and accusing. When I finally reached my door, I noticed something I'd overlooked before. There was no key. We weren't trusted with keys to our own rooms. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the hum of the building's heating system and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway. My mind kept returning to a conversation I'd had with David years ago, when he was studying for the bar exam. We'd been discussing estate law, and he'd explained the concept of legal guardianship with such passion. "It's about protecting vulnerable people, Mom," he'd said. Now those words had a different ring to them. The next morning I started paying attention. Really paying attention. I noticed how the staff spoke to us. Not to us, really, but at us or about us, even when we were sitting right there. "Does she need her medication? Has she eaten lunch?" As if we were children, incapable of answering for ourselves. I watched my fellow residents too. Helen Chapman, a retired university professor who'd authored 3 books on American history, being talked to like a toddler during art therapy. Frank Miller, who'd managed international trading for 40 years, having his dessert withheld because he'd been grumpy. We were all being slowly stripped of our dignity, one patronizing interaction at a time. But it was the documents that really opened my eyes. One afternoon, while the activities coordinator was setting up for bingo, I caught a glimpse of my file at the nurse's station. Dr. James Morrison's signature was at the bottom of my competency evaluation. The same Dr. Morrison who'd been David's roommate in law school. The same man who'd attended David and Claire's wedding, laughing and drinking champagne. The pieces started falling into place. That evening, I sat at my window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Across the parking lot, I could see the administration building where Linda Parker, the facility manager, was working late. Linda. Something about her seemed familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. And then it hit me. Linda Parker had been Linda Martinez 15 years ago, sitting in the back row of my night class at Charleston Public School. She'd been working as a waitress then, dreaming of going to college, but unable to afford it. I remembered writing her recommendation letter, quietly paying her application fees, helping her secure the scholarships that would change her life. As I watched her office light glowing in the gathering dusk, another memory surfaced. My brother, Robert's inheritance, the one I'd never told anyone about, not even David. The careful investments I'd made with John Matthews, my old friend and attorney. The Skyline Properties portfolio that had grown beyond my wildest expectations. I felt a smile spread across my face. Not the placid, compliant smile they expected from their elderly residents, but something sharper, more purposeful. They thought they'd written my story's ending, typed it up in neat legal documents, and filed it away. But they'd forgotten something crucial. I'd spent 40 years teaching literature. I knew that every great story had its turning point, its moment of revelation. That night, I started planning. Not with the fury of revenge, but with the quiet patience of someone who knows that justice, like a well-crafted narrative, requires careful structure. I thought about the property deed buried in John Matthews's files, about Linda's office light glowing in the darkness, about all the threads I could weave together. They wanted me to be a character in their story. The declining mother, the burden, the problem to be managed. But they'd forgotten that I'd always preferred to be the author. The hardest part of executing a perfect plan is making it look like you're not planning anything at all. I learned this from years of watching my students prepare their end-of-year pranks. The successful ones were always those who maintained their usual routines while quietly setting everything in motion. So I kept to my schedule at Sunset Grove. Breakfast at 8, morning exercise at 9:30, scheduled activities in the afternoon. I smiled at the nurses, took my vitamins without complaint, attended every bland social event they organized. To all appearances, I was adapting well to institutional life, becoming the docile elderly resident they expected me to be. But I was watching, waiting, and most importantly, building connections. It started with Linda. One morning, I deliberately took a wrong turn and ended up near her office. She was on the phone, her voice carrying through the half-open door. "Yes, Mr. Simmons. I understand the budget constraints, but we can't keep cutting back on staff. No, sir. I don't think serving the same meal 3 days in a row is an acceptable solution." I knocked softly on her doorframe. When she looked up, I saw the exact moment recognition flickered in her eyes. "Mrs. Walker?" she said, quickly ending her call. I wasn't sure if you'd remember." "Room 23, back row, next to the window," I said, sitting down across from her desk. "You wrote your final essay on Maya Angelou's Still I Rise. Got an A+. Her eyes welled up. "You paid for my college application fees. You wrote those recommendation letters. I never got to properly thank you. And now here you are, running this place," I said, looking pointedly at the budget spreadsheets on her desk, though it seems Mr. Simmons makes that challenging. Over the next hour, Linda told me everything. Richard Simmons, the facility director, had been steadily cutting costs while raising fees. Staff turnover was high, food quality was declining, and maintenance requests were piling up. But the board of Skyline Properties, the company that owned Sunset Grove, seemed interested only in profit margins. "The residents deserve better," Linda said, her voice tight with frustration. "But every time I try to advocate for improvements, I hit a wall." I nodded sympathetically, all while making mental notes. That evening, I made my first phone call from the payphone in the lobby, the one no one used anymore because everyone had cell phones. John Matthews picked up on the second ring. "Maggie? Good Lord, I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Your number was disconnected, and when I went by your apartment—" "John," I interrupted quietly, "I need you to listen carefully, and I need you to not let anyone, especially not David, know we're in contact." As I outlined what had happened, I could hear John's pencil scratching against paper, taking notes just like he had for the past 30 years. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Good thing we set up that trust the way we did," he finally said. "David has no idea about the Skyline Properties shares?" "None," I confirmed. "After Robert died, everyone assumed I donated most of the inheritance to charity. Only you know where it really went." 60% ownership, John mused. "You know, Maggie, you could walk into Richard Simmons' office tomorrow and fire him on the spot." "Not yet," I said, watching an orderly rush past with a dinner tray. "First, we need evidence, documentation of every corner they've cut, every dollar they've misappropriated, and we need allies." Over the next few weeks, I became a model. Resident, so model that I was given permission to help in the administrative office. Filing papers, answering phones, simple tasks to help me feel useful. Little did they know that every document I touched was carefully photographed with the small camera John had smuggled in during his visit as my old friend and financial advisor. Linda, once she understood what I was doing, became my eyes and ears. She started documenting everything, Staff complaints, maintenance issues, medication errors. She recorded conversations with Simmons, kept copies of every budget report, noted every time a resident's care was compromised to save money. Meanwhile, I made friends with Helen, the history professor who'd been declared too confused to manage her own affairs by her children, despite being sharp as ever. With Susan, the former restaurant owner who still remembered every recipe she'd ever created. With Frank, who'd handled international trade deals worth millions, but wasn't allowed to choose when to have his coffee. Each of them had a story. Each of them had been stripped of their autonomy, their dignity, their right to make decisions about their own lives. And each of them, I knew, would play a crucial role in what was to come. At night, in my small room, I would sit by the window and think about David, about the little boy who'd brought me coffee during late-night grading sessions, who'd promised to always take care of me. Sometimes my heart would ache with a mother's perpetual love, but then I'd remember what he'd done, not just to me, but to my entire life's legacy. And I'd remind myself that true love sometimes requires hard lessons. The pieces were falling into place, slowly but surely. Like a chess player setting up the board, I was positioning everything exactly where it needed to be. Soon, very soon, it would be time to make my move. When you've taught literature for 40 years, you learn that the most powerful stories are built on details. It's not the grand gestures that move readers. It's the small, precise observations that make a narrative ring true. As I built my case against Sunset Grove's management, I approached it like crafting a story, collecting details that would be impossible to dismiss. The evidence appeared in unexpected places, like the lunch menu that listed fresh garden vegetables, but actually served canned corn 3 times a week, or the staff rotation schedule that showed one nurse handling 38 residents during night shifts. Every discrepancy was carefully photographed with my hidden camera. Every incident logged in a small notebook I kept beneath my mattress. Helen, my newfound ally, proved invaluable. As a history professor, she had an eye for documentation that rivaled my own. She began keeping a detailed diary of daily life at Sunset Grove, noting everything from medication delays to maintenance issues. "It's like living in a Dickensian institution," she remarked one evening, "except with better lighting and worse food." One Tuesday morning, while helping in the administrative office, I discovered something that made my hands tremble. A stack of incident reports, filed but never addressed, falls that had never been investigated, complaints about missing personnel, items that had been ignored, requests for medical attention that had been delayed for days. "Oh, those," Linda said when I quietly showed them to her. "Mr. Simmons says we need to prioritize actionable issues, which apparently means anything that might result in a lawsuit." Her face hardened. "I've been keeping copies of everything." The next day, John Matthews made another of his friendly visits. As we sat in the garden appearing to enjoy the autumn sunshine, he slipped me a USB drive. "I've been doing some digging into Skyline Properties' financial records," he murmured. "They've been systematically inflating costs while cutting services. The profit margins here are obscene." I nodded, watching a group of residents being herded toward the recreation room for another round of bingo. "And my apartment? Rented, out at twice what you were paying," John replied. "The lease is in Claire's name. They're collecting the rent through a separate account." That night, I lay awake thinking about David, about the little boy who'd once cried because he thought a classmate had been treated unfairly. When had he become someone who could do this? Not just to me, but to an entire community of vulnerable people? The answer, I suspected, lived in the sharp angles of Claire's ambition and the cold calculations of corporate law. But I wasn't just gathering evidence against my son. I was building something else too. A community. Susan, the former restaurant owner, had started holding secret cooking classes in the small kitchen near the laundry room, teaching interested residents how to make simple meals, using only a microwave and whatever we could salvage from our bland dining options. Frank had organized a current events discussion group that met under the guise of reminiscence therapy. Helen's history lectures, officially labeled as memory exercises, drew growing crowds. We were creating a parallel world within Sunset Grove's walls, one where we weren't just passive recipients of care, but active participants in our own lives. Linda helped where she could, turning a blind eye to our unauthorized activities while documenting every instance of official neglect. The residents began to change. I watched as people who had been withdrawn and defeated started to stand straighter, speak more firmly, question things they would have previously accepted. Mrs. Rodriguez, who hadn't spoken above a whisper since her children placed her here, stood up at dinner one evening and demanded to know why her special diet requirements were being ignored. Mr. Chen, a retired architect, began drawing up detailed plans of everything that needed repair in the building. Even the staff started coming to us. Nurses would slip us notes about understaffing issues. Kitchen workers would warn us about food quality problems. The maintenance man, Joey, began keeping a secret log of all the repairs that had been denied due to budget constraints. One evening, as I was reviewing all the evidence we'd gathered, I found myself thinking about the power of collective memory. Each person in Sunset Grove had a lifetime of experience, knowledge, and skills that hadn't disappeared just because we'd been declared incompetent. We'd been bankers, teachers, doctors, business owners, artists, and now we were using those skills to document our own story. Linda came to my room that night after her shift ended. "I found something else," she said, placing a folder on my desk. "Financial reports from the board meetings. They're planning to cut staff benefits next month. 3 nurses have already given notice." I opened my drawer and added the folder to my growing collection of evidence. "Soon," I said, more to myself than to Linda. "Very soon." The next morning, I got a call from John. "The shareholders' meeting is scheduled for next month," he said. "Are you ready?" I looked out my window at the carefully manicured grounds of Sunset Grove, where residents were being guided through their morning exercise routine. 5 minutes of seated arm movements, while a staff member spoke to them like kindergartners. "Yes," I replied, thinking of all the evidence we'd gathered, all the stories we'd documented, all the dignity that had been stripped away. I'm ready to show them exactly who they've underestimated. The morning of the shareholders' meeting dawned clear and crisp. I stood in front of my mirror, putting on my old navy blue suit that Linda had secretly retrieved from my storage unit. My hands trembled slightly as I fastened my pearl necklace, not from fear but from anticipation. For 3 months, I'd played the role of the compliant resident. Today, I would remind them who Margaret Walker really was. "Are you sure about this?" Linda asked as she helped me with the final touches. "Once we start, there's no going back." I met her eyes in the mirror. "When you were in my class, Linda, what was the first thing I taught you about standing up for yourself?" She smiled. "That timing is everything." "And our timing is perfect," I said, smoothing my jacket. The suit still fit perfectly. I'd kept it pressed and ready all these years, like a soldier maintaining her armor. "Is everyone in position?" Linda nodded. "Helen has organized the Residents' Council meeting for 10 a.m. Frank has his camera ready. Susan's getting the kitchen staff together. And John Matthews is waiting in the conference room. The plan was precise, like a well-crafted sentence, while the shareholders gathered in the main conference room of Sunset Grove's administrative building, thinking they were there for a routine quarterly meeting. Our own pieces were moving into place. I walked through the facility's corridors with my head high, noting how the staff did double takes at my transformation from shuffling resident to polished professional. At the nurses' station, I paused to sign myself out, a requirement for all residents leaving the main building. The nurse on duty, Ms. Thompson, started to protest, but something in my expression made her pause. "I'll be back for lunch," I said pleasantly, signing my name with a flourish. Though I suspect the menu might be changing soon, the administrative building was a short walk across the manicured grounds. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Richard Simmons setting up his presentation, probably preparing to show more charts about cost-cutting measures and profit margins. The other board members were settling into their leather, chairs, coffee cups, and tablets at the ready. None of them noticed John Matthews slip in and take a seat at the back. None of them paid attention to Linda quietly positioning herself by the door, and none of them looked twice at me as I walked in, my heels clicking purposefully against the polished floor. "Excuse me," Simmons said, frowning. "This is a private meeting. Residents aren't allowed." "Actually, Mr. Simmons," I interrupted, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "I believe the majority shareholder has every right to attend." I pulled a folder from my briefcase, the one containing my ownership documents for Skyline Properties, and placed it on the table. "Shall we begin?" The room fell silent. Simmons' face went from red to white as he looked at the papers. One of the board members, a young man in an expensive suit, started frantically tapping on his tablet, probably trying to verify what I was saying. "This is impossible," Simmons finally sputtered. "The majority shareholder is sitting right in front of you," John Matthews said, standing up, "and has been living in your facility for the past 3 months, experiencing firsthand the results of your management decisions." I sat down at the head of the table, placing another stack of folders in front of me. "Now, I've prepared a detailed presentation of my own. First, let's discuss the incident reports that were never addressed. Linda, would you please distribute these documents?" Linda began passing out the files we'd so carefully compiled. Each board member received a thick folder containing photographs, financial records, staff complaints, and resident testimonies. I watched their faces as they began to read, noting how their expressions shifted from confusion to concern to something approaching fear. "You'll find everything thoroughly documented," I continued, my teacher's voice coming back naturally. "The understaffing issues, the misappropriated maintenance funds, the substandard food service, the inappropriate medication protocols. But perhaps most interesting is the section on financial mismanagement." I pulled out one particular document, a copy of my apartment's lease agreement in Claire's name. "We'll also need to discuss the illegal appropriation of residents' property, starting with my own." Simmons started to stand, his face now purple with rage or panic. "This is outrageous! You can't just—" "I can," I said quietly but with absolute authority. "And I am. But don't worry, Mr. Simmons. This isn't a witch hunt. This is an opportunity for transformation. Though I'm afraid that transformation will need to begin with some immediate personnel changes." Through the conference room windows, I could see residents gathering in the garden just as we'd planned. Helen was there with her notebook, Frank with his camera. Susan had brought out several of the kitchen staff. They stood together, watching, waiting. No longer invisible, no longer powerless. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, turning back to the shocked board members. "Let me tell you about my vision for the future of Sunset Grove. But first, let me tell you a story about what it means to underestimate someone just because they've grown old." The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver in my hair and the steel in my spine. I had waited 3 months for this moment. Now it was time to show them exactly what a lifetime of teaching literature and raising a lawyer had taught me about the art of a perfect revelation. By sunset that day, Richard Simmons had cleaned out his office. I watched from my window as he carried his boxes to his car, his shoulders slumped in defeat. After the board meeting, he tried to bluster his way through an explanation, but the evidence was too overwhelming. When faced with the choice between resignation and a full investigation into his financial mismanagement, he chose the former. The news spread through Sunset Grove like wildfire. I could feel the change in the air, a current of electricity running through the usually quiet halls. Residents gathered in small groups, whispering, some crying, others laughing in disbelief. The staff moved about their duties with a mixture of uncertainty and hope, stealing glances at me as I walked past. "Is it true?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked me that evening, clutching my hand. "Are we really going to get to choose when we want to eat?" "And what we want to eat," Susan chimed in, her eyes bright with possibility. She'd already drafted a proposal for improving the menu and kitchen operations. "Yes," I assured them. But that's just the beginning. I'd spent the afternoon in meetings with the board, laying out my vision for transformation. Some members resigned on the spot, unwilling to be part of such dramatic changes. Others, particularly the younger ones, seemed energized by the challenge. By evening, we had a new interim management team in place, with Linda as acting director. That night, I sat in my room writing 2 important letters. The first was to the families of all residents, explaining the changes that were coming and inviting them to be part of the transformation. The second was to David. "Dear David," I wrote, my hand steady despite the weight of the words. "By now you've probably received a call from your friend Dr. Morrison. You'll soon learn that the legal documents declaring me incompetent have been invalidated. The proceeds from my apartment's rental will need to be returned, and all powers of attorney have been revoked. But this letter isn't about legal matters. It's about something more fundamental. Respect, not just for me, but for every person who's ever been dismissed because of their age. You once told me that law was about protecting the vulnerable. Somewhere along the way, you forgot that protection shouldn't mean imprisonment, that care shouldn't mean control. I'm not writing to condemn you. I'm writing to invite you to learn from this, to remember the boy who brought his mother coffee during late-night grading sessions, who believed in justice and fairness. He's still in there, I believe, beneath the layers of ambition and influence that Claire and your career have built around you. Tomorrow we begin implementing changes at what will now be called Bright Horizons Senior Community. I'd like you to be part of this transformation, but on different terms. Come see what dignity in aging really looks like. Come remember what it means to truly care for someone. Love, Mom. I sealed the envelope just as Linda knocked on my door. She entered with a stack of papers and a determined expression. "The staff scheduling changes you requested are done," she said. "We'll have proper coverage starting tomorrow. And I've contacted several local restaurants about partnering with us for meal services until we can renovate the kitchen." "Excellent," I nodded. "And the resident council?" "Helen's organized the first official meeting for tomorrow morning. Frank's bringing his camera to document everything. They want you to speak." I smiled, thinking of how quickly my fellow residents had embraced their reclaimed power. Already I could see them standing taller, speaking more confidently. Mr. Chen had spent the afternoon measuring the common areas, planning renovations to make them more accessible and welcoming. Mrs. Henderson, a former librarian, was organizing a committee to create a proper library space. "There's something else," Linda added, hesitating slightly. "Some of the nurses, they're worried about their jobs. Tell them they're getting raises," I said firmly. "And proper staffing ratios. No more 16-hour shifts or 30 patients per nurse. We're going to do this right." After Linda left, I stood at my window, watching the lights of Charleston in the distance. The same city where I'd raised David, where I'd taught generations of students, where I'd learned that sometimes the quietest revolutions are the most powerful. Tomorrow would bring challenges, resistance from those comfortable with the old way, skepticism from families who'd grown used to having complete control, the complicated logistics of transforming an institution. But tonight I could feel the pulse of change running through the building, the whispered conversations, the tentative plans, the first fragile blooms of hope. In my desk drawer lay the small camera that had documented everything, every indignity, every cut corner, every dismissive interaction. But next to it now sat a new notebook, its pages ready to record a different kind of story, one of restoration, of dignity reclaimed, of wisdom honored. The night shift nurse passed by my door, and for the first time she knocked before entering to do her rounds. "Good evening, Mrs. Walker," she said, and I could hear the difference in her voice. Respect replacing condescension, partnership replacing paternalism. "Good evening," I replied, thinking of all the changes tomorrow would bring. "I believe it is indeed." David's call came at 7:30 the next morning. I was already up reviewing renovation proposals with Linda when my phone rang. For a moment, I just looked at his name on the screen, remembering all the calls I'd made that had gone unanswered over the past months. "Hello, David," I said calmly, motioning for Linda to stay. She'd become more than an ally. She deserved to witness this. "Mom," his voice cracked slightly. I don't understand. The Skyline Properties documents, the ownership papers. How long have you... 15 years, I replied. Since Uncle Robert's inheritance. The same inheritance you and Claire assumed I'd given away to charity. The silence on the other end was heavy with realization. When he spoke again, his lawyer's composure had returned. "We were trying to protect you. After the fall that resulted in nothing more than a bruise?" I interrupted quietly. "Or do you mean you were protecting my assets? The apartment you rented out in Claire's name?" Another silence. I could picture him in his Manhattan office, morning sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, his world tilting on its axis. "Your friend Dr. Morrison has already admitted to falsifying the competency evaluation," I continued. "He was quite cooperative once he understood the legal implications. The same goes for the administrator who processed those fraudulent power of attorney documents." "Mom, please." His voice had lost its professional edge. "We can fix this. Whatever changes you want to make to your care arrangement." "This isn't about my care arrangement, David. This is about the systematic degradation of human dignity. This is about every resident here who's been treated like a child. Every family member who's been misled about the care their loved ones receive. Every staff member who's been overworked and underpaid." I could hear him taking deep breaths, probably trying to formulate a legal strategy. But I wasn't done. "The board has approved a complete overhaul of operations. Bright Horizons will become a model for dignified senior living. And you, David, are going to help make that happen." "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. 4 hours per week of pro bono legal services to our residents, helping them review their rights, their financial arrangements, their health care, directives, ensuring no one else goes through what I did. And if I refuse, then I press charges for fraud and financial exploitation of a senior citizen. Dr. Morrison's statement alone would be quite compelling in court." The silence stretched out again. But this time, I could hear something different in it. Perhaps the first stirrings of shame. Or maybe just the shock of discovering that the mother he'd dismissed as declining was still very much the woman who had raised him. "I'll have my secretary clear my Thursday afternoons," he finally said. "Good," I replied. "Your first session is tomorrow at 2. Don't be late." The transformation of Sunset Grove into Bright Horizons happened both overnight and gradually. The sign changed on a Tuesday morning. I watched from my window as the old letters came down and the new ones went up, glinting in the Charleston sun. But the real changes, the ones that mattered, unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Susan took charge of the dining services revolution. Gone were the bland institutional meals served at rigid times. Instead, we created a cafe-style dining room open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., with residents free to eat when they chose. Local restaurants provided training to our kitchen staff, and Susan's cooking classes became official activities. "Today we're teaching proper sauce techniques," she announced one morning, her eyes sparkling as residents and staff gathered in the newly renovated teaching kitchen. "And yes, Richard," she added to our former CEO's replacement, "this is a budgeted program. Good food is healthcare." Helen's history lectures evolved into a full educational program. Residents became both students and teachers. Mr. Chen taught architecture appreciation. Frank offered classes on international trade, and I returned to my roots with literature seminars. The library, under Mrs. Henderson's guidance, grew from a few scattered paperbacks to a proper collection, complete with a digital catalog and reading nooks. But it was David's first legal clinic that truly showed me how deep the changes were running. He arrived 5 minutes early, wearing his best suit and carrying a leather briefcase. I watched from the doorway as he set up in the conference room, arranging his papers with nervous precision. Mrs. Rodriguez was his first appointment. She came in clutching documents about her house, which her children had sold without her full understanding. I saw David start to slip into his corporate lawyer mode. But then he caught my eye across the room. Something shifted in his expression, and suddenly he was truly listening to her, asking the right questions, taking detailed notes. "We can challenge this," I heard him tell her. "You were pressured into signing without proper legal counsel. It's a clear case of undue influence." By the end of the afternoon, he had taken on 3 cases of financial exploitation and helped 2 residents revoke fraudulent power of attorney arrangements. When he packed up his briefcase, his hands were shaking slightly. "I didn't know," he said quietly as I walked him to his car, "about all of this, about how common it is." "Now you do," I replied, "and you're doing something about it." The news spread beyond our walls. Local papers ran stories about our transformation. Other facilities began sending representatives to learn about our model. Linda fielded calls from healthcare administrators across the country, all wanting to know how we'd revolutionized our approach to senior care. But the most meaningful changes were the smallest ones. The way residents now held keys to their own rooms. The sight of people gathering freely in the common areas, no longer bound by rigid activity schedules. The sound of laughter floating from the cafe where residents and staff shared meals together. One evening, I found Frank in the garden, teaching a group of nurses about international currency markets, while they helped him tend to the new herb garden, his pet project for the kitchen. "You know what the best part is?" he said when I joined them. "They actually want to learn. They see us as people with something to offer, not just bodies to be managed." I thought about his words later that night as I reviewed the latest facility reports with Linda. Our costs had actually decreased since implementing the changes. It turned out that treating people with dignity, while priceless, was also cost-effective. Happy residents needed fewer medications. Empowered staff had better attendance rates. Even our insurance premiums had dropped due to fewer incidents and accidents. "We're becoming a case study in healthcare management," Linda said, showing me the latest article about Bright Horizons in a medical journal. "They're calling it the Dignity First model." I smiled, thinking of all the residents who had found their voices again, all the staff members who now took pride in their work, all the families who were rediscovering their elderly relatives as people rather than problems to be managed. "No," I corrected her gently. "We're becoming a community. The rest is just details." The article appeared in the New York Times on a Sunday morning. Helen had written it. "The revolution in room 237, how one woman transformed elder care." And it spread across social media like wildfire. My phone started ringing at 7 a.m., and Linda had to set up a makeshift press office in the conference room. But it wasn't the media attention that made that day memorable. It was the unexpected visit from Claire and Ethan. I was in the garden, helping Frank with his herb collection, when I saw them walking across the lawn. Claire looked different, less polished, more human somehow. Ethan, now 10, ran ahead of her, his face bright with excitement. "Grandma!" he called out, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Mom says you own this whole place, and that you're famous now." Over his head, I met Claire's eyes. The carefully constructed facade of the corporate executive's wife had cracked, revealing something raw and uncertain beneath. "Margaret," she said softly, I've been reading about what you've done here, about the changes you've made. I invited them to join me for lunch in the cafe. Susan had outdone herself that day. Fresh tomato soup, artisanal sandwiches, and her famous lemon tart. As we ate, Ethan chatted about school and his soccer team, while Claire sat quietly, taking in the atmosphere around us. The dining room was alive with conversation. At one table, a group of residents discussed current events with 2 nurses. At another, Mr. Chen was sketching building improvements on a napkin, while staff members offered suggestions. Through the windows, we could see Mrs. Henderson leading a poetry reading in the garden. "It's so different," Claire finally said, "from what it was before, from what we thought it needed to be." "What did you think it needed to be, Claire?" I asked gently. She looked down at her half-eaten sandwich. "Safe, controlled. I thought that was what care meant. Control." Ethan had wandered over to Frank's table, where he was getting an impromptu lesson about international currencies, his eyes wide with fascination. "You know," Claire continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "my own grandmother died in a place like this used to be. I visited her once near the end. She didn't even recognize me. I convinced myself that's just what happens, that we all end up empty shells, needing to be managed." "But that's not what happened to her," I said. "That's what was done to her." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "David's different since he started working here. He talks about his clients, your residents, all the time. About their stories, their rights, their dignity. He's becoming the lawyer he always wanted to be, not just the one I pushed him to be." I reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time we'd ever truly touched. It's not too late, you know, for any of us. That evening, after they left, I sat in my room reflecting on the day. On my desk were more interview requests, invitations to speak at conferences, proposals from other facilities wanting to implement our model. But what mattered most was the small drawing Ethan had left behind. A picture of me in the garden, surrounded by flowers and people, with "My Amazing Grandma" written in crooked letters at the bottom. Linda knocked on my door, carrying a stack of papers. "The State Healthcare Board wants to use Bright Horizons as a model for new regulations," she announced. "They're calling it the Walker Standard." I thought about all the other Maggies out there, all the seniors being stripped of their dignity in the name of care, about all the Davids and Claires, thinking they were doing the right thing in the wrong way, about all the Ethans, growing up in a world that needed to relearn the value of its elders. "The Walker Standard," I repeated softly. "Well, we'd better make sure we get it right then." And in that moment, I realized that what had started as an act of personal justice had grown into something far larger than myself. Like ripples becoming waves, our small revolution was spreading, carrying with it the simple but powerful truth that age should never equal imprisonment, that care should never mean control. The invitation to speak at the National Conference on Aging in Washington, D.C. arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of a literature discussion with Helen's reading group when Linda brought it in, her eyes shining with excitement. "They want you to deliver the keynote address," she said, handing me the letter. "The theme is redefining elder care for the 21st century." I looked around our newly renovated library, where residents were engaged in animated discussion about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd recently won her house back with David's help, was arguing passionately about Elizabeth Bennet's character development. Mr. Chen had sketched a detailed rendering of Pemberley Manor on his tablet, sharing it with the group. "I'll go," I said, "but not alone. This story belongs to all of us." Over the next few weeks, we prepared our presentation as a community. Helen compiled statistics showing how our resident-focused approach had improved health outcomes and reduced medication needs. Susan documented how our flexible dining program had improved nutrition rates and social engagement. Frank prepared an economic analysis showing the financial viability of our model. David, who'd become a regular fixture at Bright Horizons through his legal clinics, helped us prepare the legal framework for what we now called the Dignity Initiative. He'd changed over these months, the corporate shark softening into something more akin to a public defender for the elderly. The day before we left for Washington, I found Ethan waiting in my room after school. He'd started coming regularly, doing his homework in the library while listening to resident stories. "Mom says you're going to speak to Congress," he said, helping me pack my presentation materials. "Are you nervous, Grandma?" I smiled, thinking about how far we'd come from that day I'd first entered Sunset Grove with a single suitcase and a hidden plan. "No, sweetheart. When you're fighting for what's right, there's no room for nerves." That evening, looking out, my window at the garden where Frank's herbs now flourished in raised beds accessible to wheelchairs, I thought about how change really happens, not always through grand gestures or loud protests, but sometimes through quiet resistance, strategic patience, and the steady insistence on human dignity. The next morning, as our group prepared to leave for the airport, me, Linda, Helen, and David, I saw Claire's car pull up. She stepped out holding a garment bag. "Your Navy suit," she said softly. I had it cleaned and pressed. "Show them what real power looks like, Margaret." I hugged her, feeling the last walls between us crumble. Sometimes, I realized, revolution doesn't just change institutions, it heals families too. The conference hall in Washington was packed to capacity. As I stood at the podium, wearing my Navy suit and my mother's pearls, I saw faces from across the country. Healthcare administrators, policymakers, senior care advocates. In the front row sat Linda, Helen, and David. Behind them I spotted Claire and Ethan, who had flown in that morning as a surprise. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm here today not just as the owner of Bright Horizons, or as a former educator, or even as someone who experienced elder care from the inside. I'm here as a witness to both the problem and the solution." I told them our story, not just my story of secret ownership and strategic patience, but the larger story of what happens when you strip people of their dignity in the name of care. I spoke about Helen's academic credentials being ignored, about Frank's business expertise being dismissed, about Susan's culinary skills being wasted. But more importantly, I continued, I'm here to show you what's possible when we do things differently. Linda stepped up then, presenting our data. Medication usage down by 40%, depression rates cut in half, staff turnover reduced by 65%, cost savings through prevention and engagement rather than crisis management. Helen followed with her research on the psychological impact of autonomy in senior care. Frank presented the financial model showing how dignity-based care could be both ethical and profitable. And then David stood up. "As a corporate lawyer," he said, his voice steady but humbled, "I was part of the problem. I used the law to strip my own mother of her rights, believing I was protecting her. Today I use it to protect seniors from people like who I used to be." The questions afterward came rapid fire. How did we implement these changes? What were the regulatory challenges? Could this model be scaled? I watched as Linda handled the operational queries. Helen addressed the social impact concerns, and David tackled the legal implications. During the break, a woman approached me, tears in her eyes. "I'm the director of a facility in Oregon," she said. "After hearing you speak, I need to make changes. Will you help us?" Before I could answer, another administrator joined us. Then another. By the end of the day, we had requests from facilities in 12 states wanting to implement the Walker Standard. That evening, over dinner at a restaurant near the Capitol, our small group celebrated. Ethan proudly showed me the notes he'd taken during my speech. "For my school report on changing the world," he explained. Claire raised her glass in a toast. "To the Walker Standard," she said, and I noticed her corporate polish had been replaced by genuine warmth. "No," I corrected, gently. "To dignity, and to second chances." David reached over and squeezed my hand. In that moment, I saw in his eyes the little boy who'd once brought me coffee during late-night grading sessions, who'd believed in justice before he'd learned about corporate law. Later that night, in my hotel room, I received an email from the Department of Health and Human Services. They wanted to establish a national task force on senior care reform, and they wanted me to lead it. As I stood at the window looking out at the lights of Washington, D.C., I thought about how far we'd come from that first day at Sunset Grove. About how what had started as an act of personal justice had grown into a movement for change. My phone buzzed with a message from Linda. The first group of administrators would be arriving at Bright Horizons next week for training. Helen had already prepared a comprehensive orientation program. Susan was planning special menus for the workshops. Frank had developed a financial transition guide for facilities wanting to adopt our model. I smiled, thinking of all the lives we would touch, all the dignity we would restore, all the families we would help heal. Sometimes the greatest revolutions start with the smallest acts of resistance, and sometimes the quietest voices end up speaking the loudest truths. 1 year after our Washington presentation, I stand on the balcony of my new apartment at Bright Horizons, watching the sunset paint the Charleston sky in shades of pink and gold. Below, in our community garden, I can see Ethan helping Frank tend to the herb beds. They're planning to expand the garden next month. Ethan's idea, part of his school science project on sustainable community farming. The transformation has exceeded even my highest hopes. 23 facilities across the country have now adopted the Walker Standard, with another 30 in transition. Linda travels frequently, helping other communities implement our model, though she always returns with new ideas to improve our own facility. David comes twice a week now, not just for legal clinics but for dinner with his old mom. Sometimes Claire joins us, and I've noticed how she's softened, how her ambition has found a new direction in advocating for elder care reform. She's started a consulting firm helping families navigate senior care decisions ethically and compassionately. Helen's article has become a book, The Dignity Revolution, which is now required reading in several healthcare management programs. Susan runs a culinary institute where seniors teach traditional cooking to young chefs, preserving family recipes and cultural heritage. Frank's international finance lectures have become so popular that local college students often attend. But it's the smaller changes that touch my heart most deeply, like Mrs. Rodriguez teaching Spanish to the staff, her house now safely back in her name, or Mr. Chen's architectural suggestions being incorporated into our latest renovation plans. Every resident here has found their voice again, their purpose, their dignity. This morning during my literature class, we discussed Mary Oliver's question. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I looked around the room at my fellow residents, all of us in our 70s, 80s, 90s, and saw not the end of life, but its continuous unfolding. Later, as I review the latest proposals for expanding our program, I hear laughter from the garden. Ethan is showing Frank a new app he's created, a digital catalog for tracking their herbs and vegetables. The boy who once innocently revealed his parents' betrayal has become one of our most passionate advocates. "Grandma," he calls up to me, "come see what we're planning for the butterfly garden." As I make my way down to join them, I pass the wall where we've hung photos documenting our journey. The old Sunset Grove sign coming down, the first resident council meeting, our presentation in Washington. Each image tells a story of transformation, not just of a facility, but of minds, hearts, and relationships. Frank greets me with a fresh sprig of basil from his garden. "For your evening tea," he says with a wink. We've come so far from those days of regulated schedules and bland meals, from when we were treated as charges rather than people. "You know what the best part is?" Ethan asks, showing me his garden plans. "Everyone gets to help create something new, just like you did, Grandma." His words strike me deeply, because that's what we've really built here. Not just a better care facility, but a community where age brings wisdom rather than withdrawal, where years lived are valued rather than dismissed, where dignity isn't just a word, but a daily practice. The sun is setting now, casting long shadows across our flourishing gardens. In the distance, I can see new construction beginning, an expansion to accommodate the growing number of seniors seeking placement here. But we're not just building rooms. We're building a legacy of respect, understanding, and empowerment. As I watch Ethan and Frank return to their gardening, I think about the question I asked myself that first day in Sunset Grove. What happens when you underestimate someone just because they've grown old? Now I know the answer. They might just revolutionize the very system that underestimated them. And as the evening light fades and the first stars appear above Charleston, I smile, knowing that this isn't an ending at all. It's a continuation, a passing of the torch to the next generation, a reminder that it's never too late to stand up, speak out, and change the world, one dignified life at a time. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Give it a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.